Hello and welcome back to my channel and to my series Trying to Like, where I look at works of art or artists or pieces of popular culture that I can't quite decide whether I think are great or not so great, and I want to sort of generate a conversation and see what you think. Now today's subject is John Cassavetes. Cassavetes was the son of Greek immigrants into the US. And he became an actor in the 50s and 60s and was one of the poster boys, really, of sort of method acting. I always found him, when I first discovered him, a rather charmless actor, rather boorish actor. He always seemed to be rather cynical and sarcastic, sort of lopsided mouth, this kind of sarcastic smile on his face all the time, which made him perfect as the rather scurrilous husband in Rosemary's Baby, one of my favourite films. But in other movies, I just made it seem unlikable. When I got into movies in the 90s, I discovered that Cassavetes was a big name in film directing. I wasn't aware of this, but he was a major, major director, and in America he's almost regarded as the father of American independent cinema. He started making films in the late 50s, early 60s, and now these films are sort of venerated, and Cassavetes is regarded as a major American director. So I thought, well, better check this guy out. I started with a film that he made in 1978 with Ben Gazzara, one of his friends and major collaborators. A film called The Killing of a Chinese Bookie. I started with this film because it's a kind of neo-noir, gangstery type film, and I thought that would be an easy way into his cinema. And it's this film about a nightclub owner. It's sort of a strip show stroke burlesque club that he's running. And it's his life and what he loves. But he runs up some debts. So these gangsters who come to call on the debts force him, I can't remember the details of the plot, but to go and kill this Chinese bookie. The film itself is not taut like a gangster thriller. It's not tight and, economic. It's very baggy. And it spends more time watching Gazzara with this sort of weird troupe of players and dancers he has in his club, and watching their rather slipshod routines than it does with any kind of murder or gangster setting. I found the film rather baggy, rather sweaty. It seemed to me more like a sort of sweaty actor's workshop than a film that had anything to say about anything, really. It was very raw. It was obviously trying to be realistic and naturalistic, but I felt it ended up falling between two stools. But I thought I must have got this wrong because everyone admired Cassavetes so much. So I started to try and look at his other films. Now, last week, in order to prepare for this video, I watched probably his most famous and well-known film, A Woman Under the Influence. And this film seemed to me to sort of telescope together all of the problems and virtues of Cassavetes as a director. It was made in 1974, and it stars Gina Rowlands and Peter Falk. And they are a working-class couple. And she seems to be either losing her mind or has personality difficulties. And Falk is finding it difficult to cope with the sort of the changeability of her personality. It's conflicting with his work and it's conflicting with his family. And eventually he sections her. He gets around a doctor that he knows and they put her in a mental hospital. And then the film cuts to 6 months later when she returns from the hospital, and clearly she's still not very well. Now, this film is noted by many people for its acting. Gina Rowlands and Peter Falk are very good actors. And my God, they got put through the ringer in this film. I mean, everything. There's shouting, screaming, running after children, scenes where children are crying, trying to stop their mother from committing suicide. You name it, it's in there. And Peter Falk and Gina Rowlands give it everything. They're going for that Oscar here, baby. And the whole film is very raw. It's also raw in the way it's filmed. Cassavetes does not go for beautiful cinema. He tries to find the image that's right and that thrusts you into the narrative. So, when Peter Falk gets into a car with his mates to to go to a party for his wife who's coming back from mental hospital. You know, the camera goes right in. It's almost on Peter Falk's chest, and you can see his chest hair as he gets in and he squeezes in amongst his friends. And that kind of is the whole feel of the film. It's raw, messy filmmaking. You're in there with the actors type of thing. You can see their sweat, you know. And it's very impressive. It's very powerful. It wrenches the emotions out of you. But then how difficult is it to get emotions watching a woman losing her mind, losing her family, being hit by her husband? These are very emotive things, aren't they? Even if a poor director gave you this narrative, you'd be affected by it because you're a human being. I worry about this film because, in a way, what Cassavetes has done is very impressive. He's stripped away any kind of psychological narrative or, you know, message or political or ideological framework. We're just watching two people, we're just dumped in their lives and we're watching them trying to cope. And in a way, to be able to do that is quite impressive. It's quite an impressive achievement. Very few directors these days can do it. But there is a problem. And the problem is that if you do that and you just leave the audience with the actors and characters that could do anything at any time just because that's who they are, yes, you get a sense of the chaotic nature of life, but also you're just being left with the actors. You're just watching Peter Falk doing Peter Falk stuff. You're just watching Gina Rowlands doing that scene there without any kind of context at all, any kind of meaning, political, ideological, social, cultural. You're just left with actors going through an actor's workshop. What does it actually mean? You see, Cassavetes quite rightly could say, people are always trying to derive meaning onto lives. Why don't we just watch lives being lived? I kind of agree with him. But the problem is we don't live like that. We all bring our own sense to a film. We all bring our own sense of what's going on in society, right? So we bring our sense of how people deal with mental ill health, for example. How a man and a woman, interact in a marriage. From whatever cultural, social background, we bring ourselves and our own ways of making meaning. So it doesn't quite work. To give an example of what I mean, in the film, Peter Falk and Gina Rowlands are supposed to be working class. Yet many of their wider family units seem to be middle class and act in a middle class manner, like Peter Falk's mother, for example. There seems to be a disjunct between his mother and him. He doesn't seem to have come from her background. Similarly, Gina Rowlands' parents seem to be middle class. And at the end of the film, at the party when Gina Rowlands comes back, the two women who are organising the party seem like they're coming from a Woody Allen film. And again, what's happening here, it seems to me, is Cassavetes is bringing together a whole group of actors who he admires and who are naturalistic, but they're not of the same class. Now, you could say, well, life is complicated. Different classes mixed, there are different people in a family, it's not all just one set, and that's absolutely right. But we can't help bringing our perceptions of the society we live in and we understand to the film. Cassavetes say, well, why don't you just accept these people as they are? But we don't in fiction accept people as they are. They have to have a truth according to what we understand as reality. This is the bind, I think, that Cassavetes' films are in. In The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, do we really believe in Ben Gazzara's club? Do we really believe such a place exists, or that the actors and dancers in it exist? I don't. I think this is my problem with Cassavetes. His films are raw, and they're aiming for a realism, but I don't believe in the people they're showing. I don't know these people. Do they really exist? Does anyone act like Peter Falk's character acts in A Woman Under the Influence towards their wife having mental health problems? I don't think so. I don't think the children seem extremely middle class and are actually quite well adjusted, despite the fact that they're living in an incredibly dysfunctional family. How does that work? Is it realistic, for example, that Falk, having sent this woman who he loves into a mental hospital, doesn't see her for 6 months? There's no reality here. This is pure fantasy. The problem with directors who try to be realistic and naturalistic is this: realism is an affectation. It's a stylistic approach just as much as any kind of fantasy or surrealism is. So, for example, in the 1950s, if someone went to see Anthony Mann's Men in War, they'd have thought this was an extremely realistic portrait of men in combat, probably more realistic than anything up to that point. But it wasn't true to what they went through. It's just that it gave the impression of getting closer to the real experience and how men reacted in that situation. Years later, with different filmic techniques, out comes Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. And people are like, oh my God, look how realistic that is, going up on the beaches with those bullets whizzing around and everything, and the chaos. That's what it was like. Is it, or is it that with the changing of the style of filmmaking, that's come to seem more realistic? Did Cassavetes and the way his actors approached things in the 70s seem more realistic? Because in comparison to the fiction of that time, the Hollywood style of that time, it seemed more raw. But does it strike us as realistic now? I mean, is the realism of modern day cinema any more realistic than Cassavetes? It's not really. It's just a different mode of showing things. That's really all it is. I suppose ultimately what I'm arguing here is that Cassavetes is probably a brilliant filmmaker, certainly a good director of actors, who's boxed himself into a corner. And in his desire to create realism, which I think, as I've tried to explain, I think is a sort of fake desire in the first place, a sort of, misguided desire, by trying to do that, he actually creates films that don't really say much to their audience. It puts them through the ringer, it gives them a powerful emotional experience, but does it leave them with anything to think about afterwards? That's the question that I really want to generate in the comments below and the conversation below. So please let me know what you think. And if you like my content, please like and subscribe.